Today I'm going to share with you a story that happened in the distant year of 1873, in a small Mexican town called San Jacinto del Nogal. It's the story of Melissa, a woman who dared to seek a new destiny when life seemed to have already denied her all chances of happiness. This is a narrative about silent courage, about how true love sometimes doesn't save, but always transforms. It's about a woman who discovered she didn't need to be named by anyone to be worth what she was. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, from which city are you following this story? I love knowing where our listeners come from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like if the story touches your hearts. Your participation keeps the art of storytelling alive. San Jacinto del Nogal, Mexico, year 1873. When the wind blows through the dirt streets and the distant mountains are tinged with purple at the end of the afternoon, you can still hear the echoes of a story that forever changed this small settlement in northern Mexico. A story of dignity, choices, and the transformative power of a woman who came seeking love and discovered something much greater, her own strength. The train exhaled white vapors against the orange sky when Melissa Soledad stepped down at the abandoned station of San Jacinto del Nogal. Her feet, shod in worn leather boots, touched the Mexican earth with the delicacy of one who carries fragile hopes. The traveling dress, in dark brown tone like dry earth, contrasted with the grey rebozo that protected her shoulders from the cutting afternoon wind. At 42 years old, Melissa possessed the serene beauty of one who had learned to find peace in small things. Her hair, where silver strands danced among brown locks, was pulled back in a low chignon that revealed her pale nape and elegant neck. Her hands, slightly rough from work in Puebla, carefully held a leather suitcase and a small valise where she kept her most precious possession, a white cotton wedding dress embroidered with delicate orange blossoms. This dress was more than a piece of clothing. It was the materialization of a promise made through letters, exchanged for months with Santiago Herrera, a former soldier of the Republic who had invited her to a new life in the north. There will be no luxuries, he had written in his last letter, but there will be respect and a place where loneliness doesn't echo so loudly. The settlement that stretched before her was smaller than she had imagined. Low adobe houses, some with straw roofs worn by time, lined narrow streets where skinny chickens scratched between muddy puddles. The smell of tortillas burning on some distant stove mixed with the dry aroma of earth and the sweet perfume of pitayas growing wild between the houses. Melissa walked slowly, orienting herself by the description Santiago had given in his letters. The house is on the street that leads to the cemetery. It has a faded blue door and two small windows that face east. Her heart beat in an irregular rhythm, between expectation and a strange apprehension she couldn't name. When she found the house, however, her chest tightened. The blue door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. The windows that should frame her new home had some loose boards, and dry vines partially covered the adobe walls like veils of abandonment. The yard, which Santiago had described as small but where some flowers grow, was an arid space where only two skinny dogs took turns in the shade of a solitary poplar. "Santiago?" Her voice came out lower than she intended, almost a whisper swallowed by the wind. From inside the house came a hoarse cough, followed by a weak voice that barely distinguished itself from the noise of dry leaves. "Come in, daughter. Come in quickly." Melissa pushed the door, which yielded with a groan. The smell that greeted her was a mixture of medicinal herbs, tallow candles, and something indefinable, perhaps loneliness itself materialized in odor. In the penumbra, her eyes took time to adjust. What she saw made her hold her breath. An elderly woman with completely white hair, braided in two thick coils that fell over her bony shoulders, was lying in an iron bed that occupied almost the entire small room. Her eyes, blue like faded aquamarine, met Melissa's with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to relief. "You are her," said the old woman, not as a question, but as a statement. "The woman from the letters." Yes, I'm Melissa Soledad. Santiago invited me. Where is he?" The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was in them a sadness deep like ancient wells. "My son departed," she said simply. "He departed after he brought me to this bed. He said he would return, but—" Her voice was lost in a cough that made her bend over herself. Melissa felt the world swaying around her. Santiago had departed. When? For how long? And who was this woman? In his letters, he had never mentioned a sick mother. How many days ago? She managed to ask. I no longer know, daughter. Days mix when a person lives only in shadows. The old woman tried to straighten up in bed. But you came, that means there is hope. Melissa looked around. The house was even smaller inside than it seemed from outside. Besides the room where they were, there was only a small kitchen with a wood stove that didn't seem to have been used for weeks, and a tiny room that could serve as a pantry. There were no signs of recent male presence. No clothes, no personal objects, only the minimal belongings of an elderly and sick woman. What is your name, Senora? Doña Refugio, replied the elderly woman, extending a translucent hand that Melissa took between hers. And you will stay, won't you? Please say you will stay. Melissa looked at the suitcase she still held, at the wedding dress waiting in her valise, at that unknown woman who looked at her with a mixture of supplication and hope. All her expectations, all her dreams, carefully constructed through months of correspondence, seemed to crumble like the peeling walls of that house. But something in the fragility of that elderly woman, something in the loneliness that permeated every corner of that place, touched a deep chord in her heart. Melissa knew loneliness, she knew helplessness, and she also knew the silent strength that is born from the decision not to abandon those who need help. I will stay, she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. At least until Santiago returns. The smile that lit up Doña Refugio's face was like the first ray of sun after a long storm, and so, without knowing it, Melissa took the first step on a journey that would take her far beyond what any letter could promise. That first night, while organizing her few things in the small room next to the kitchen and listening to the irregular breathing of the elderly woman in the adjacent room, Melissa wondered if Santiago would ever return. And if he returned, would he find her still there, caring for a stranger out of pure compassion? What she didn't know was that her answer to that question would change not only her destiny, but that of the entire settlement. The first ray of sun that filtered through the cracks in the windows found Melissa already awake, sitting in a straw chair beside Doña Refugio's bed. She had spent the night almost sleepless, watching the difficult breathing of the elderly woman and trying to understand the labyrinth of circumstances that had led her there. The house revealed itself to be even more deteriorated in daylight. The wooden beam ceiling was sunken in some places, and spiderwebs formed ghostly lace in the corners. On the wall opposite the bed, Melissa noticed rectangular marks that were lighter on the adobe, as if pictures or photographs had been recently removed. It was as if someone had purposely erased any trace of memories. "The dogs," murmured Doña Refugio, opening her eyes without lifting her head from the worn pillow. "They need water." Melissa followed the elderly woman's gaze toward the yard, where the two dogs, a mixed German shepherd with greyish fur and a brown mutt with a drooping ear, watched her through the half-open door. Their eyes shone with a melancholic intelligence, as if they understood they were the only guardians of that fragmented home. "What are their names?" asked Melissa, getting up to fetch water. "Niebla and Chato," replied Doña Refugio, with a whisper of a smile. "Santiago brought them when they were puppies. He said every house needed hearts that beat even when humans fell silent." This simple phrase revealed to Melissa something fundamental about the man who had invited her to a new life. He possessed poetic sensitivity, a capacity to see beauty and necessity where others would see only obligation. Why then had he departed, leaving so much abandonment behind? While filling a bowl with water from the well in the yard, Melissa observed the surroundings with more attention. The house sat on a slight elevation, offering a partial view of the settlement that extended down the valley. Smoke rose from some chimneys, indicating life in motion, people waking to another day of work. But there, in that small property, everything seemed suspended in time, waiting for the return of someone who might never come back. "Daughter," called Doña Refugio when Melissa returned. "There's a basket there behind the door, lift it." Melissa found a wicker basket containing some silver and copper coins, wrapped in a piece of faded purple fabric. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to buy what was needed for a few days. "Use it for what we need," said the elderly woman, "and when you go to the settlement, listen. Listen to what they say about my son." There was something in the intonation of Doña Refugio's voice that made Melissa look at her with renewed attention. The elderly woman averted her gaze, fixing it on the humidity-stained ceiling, but not before Melissa perceived a shadow of fear passing through her faded eyes. The path to the center of the settlement wound between humble houses, each telling its own story of resistance against the aridity of the land and the harshness of life. Melissa walked slowly, absorbing the details. Colored cotton curtains fluttering in windows, straw baskets drying in the sun, the rhythmic sound of hands pounding corn in stone mortars. Some women observed her with discreet curiosity, whispering among themselves when they thought she didn't see them. Melissa realized that her arrival had not gone unnoticed. In a small community, a foreigner carrying a heavy suitcase and wearing traveling clothes was novelty enough to fuel conversations for days. Don Antonio's store was on a strategic corner where two streets met, forming a small square. It was a low building with thick walls, with a wide door that remained open to attract fresh breezes. The interior smelled of spices, homemade soap, and the tanned leather of harnesses hanging on the walls. Don Antonio was a middle-aged man with a well-groomed grayish mustache and small eyes that seemed to catalogue and evaluate everything they saw. When Melissa entered, he interrupted the conversation he was having with another man and directed a commercial smile at her. "Good morning, Senora. How may I serve you?" "I need some basic things," said Melissa, approaching the counter. "Beans, rice, some candles, and perhaps some medicine for cough." "Ah, so it's true," said the other man, a tall gentleman with a white beard who leaned on a carved wooden staff. "You are the woman Santiago brought from Puebla." Melissa felt something contract in her stomach. "Santiago didn't bring me. I came on my own, responding to an invitation." The two men exchanged a look she couldn't interpret. Don Antonio cleared his throat, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's just that, well, you must know that Santiago departed, right?" "Yes, Doña Refugio told me. Do you know when he returns?" The silence that followed was dense, like the atmosphere before a storm. The man with the staff looked at Don Antonio, who concentrated excessively on organizing some packages on the counter. "Senora," said finally the man with the white beard, "my name is Don Esteban, and I was a friend of the Herrera family for many years. If you allow me the question, did Santiago write to you recently?" "Yes, of course, that's why I'm here." Melissa rummaged in the small bag she carried and took out the last letter she had received. This arrived 3 weeks ago. He confirmed my coming and said he would wait for me at the station. Don Esteban extended his hand and Melissa gave him the letter. He examined it carefully, turning it, observing the handwriting, the paper, even the seal. His expression became increasingly grave. "Doña Melissa," he said finally, returning the letter to her. "This handwriting, so it's not Santiago's." The world seemed to sway under Melissa's feet. "What do you mean? All the letters I received, did they all have this same handwriting?" Melissa nodded, feeling a strange cold spreading through her chest. "Santiago could barely write his own name," said Don Esteban gently. "Whenever he needed something written, he asked for help. And it's been more than 2 months since he departed, leaving his mother under care. Well, without anyone's care, to be honest. The revelation fell upon Melissa like an avalanche. Someone had forged the letters, someone had impersonated Santiago to lure her there. But why and who? "Is there something else I should know?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Don Antonio and Don Esteban again exchanged that look laden with meaning. It was Don Esteban who spoke. Santiago departed after his sister's burial. He was disturbed. He said some words about justice and departed one dawn, taking only his horse and a change of clothes. Since then, no one has had news of him. The sister? Melissa remembered the marks on the wall, the empty spaces that suggested removed objects. What happened to her? Luz was very young, said Don Antonio quietly. She became gravely ill and, well, we don't have a doctor here. Santiago tried to get help, but the sentence hung in the air like a weight no one wanted to carry. Melissa understood she had arrived at a place marked by tragedy, where wounds still bled and secrets hid in the shadows of silences. She bought what she needed and returned to the house with a sense of unreality taking hold of her thoughts. If the letters weren't from Santiago, who had written them? And why had Doña Refugio received her as if she already knew of her existence? When she arrived, she found the elderly woman sitting in bed, supported by improvised pillows, looking out the window with an expression that seemed to mix expectation and resignation. "Did you discover something interesting in the settlement?" asked Doña Refugio without taking her eyes from the window. Melissa hesitated. How to tell a mother that the letters that brought a stranger to care for her were false? How to explain that someone had orchestrated that entire situation with purposes she still couldn't understand? "Don Esteban said it's been 2 months since Santiago departed," she said carefully. "Yes," replied Doña Refugio simply. 2 months, 3 days, and some hours I don't know how to count." Her tranquility before the fact left Melissa even more intrigued. It was as if the elderly woman knew more than she revealed, as if she kept secrets that only time would show appropriate to share. That second night, while preparing chamomile tea for Doña Refugio and listening to the dogs settling in the yard, Melissa wondered if she should leave. Her life in Puebla had been simple but safe. There, each moment brought a new layer of mystery, a new question without answer. But when she took the tea to the elderly woman and saw sincere gratitude shining in those faded blue eyes, she knew she couldn't abandon her. At least not yet. Not while she hadn't discovered who had written those letters and why a lonely and sick woman had been left in a ruined house. "Doña Refugio," she said quietly, helping her settle for the night. "Who knew I was coming?" The elderly woman held her hand with surprising strength for someone so fragile. "Daughter," she murmured, "some questions should only be asked when we're ready for any answer." And with that enigmatic phrase echoing in her mind, Melissa prepared for another night of vigil, not knowing that the next day she would discover she wasn't the only woman who had received letters from a Santiago Herrera who perhaps didn't exist. The third morning brought with it a dry wind that raised small whirlwinds of dirt in the streets of San Jacinto del Nogal. Melissa had awakened with a new determination. She needed to find answers to the questions that multiplied in her mind like shadows at dusk. Doña Refugio was sleeping deeply for the first time since her arrival, perhaps lulled by the constant care Melissa had dedicated to her. The elderly woman seemed less pale, and her breathing sounded more regular. The home remedies Melissa had prepared, eucalyptus teas and warm compresses, were beginning to take effect. Taking advantage of the tranquility, Melissa decided to explore the house with more attention. There was something in the arrangement of the rooms, in the way certain spaces seemed to have been emptied hastily, that suggested untold stories. In the small room that served as a pantry, she discovered a pile of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, hidden behind sacks of beans. Her heart raced when she recognized her own handwriting. They were the letters she had sent to Santiago during the last 6 months. All were there, sealed, without a single one having been opened. The discovery was like a blow to the stomach. Santiago had never read her words, never known of her carefully shared dreams, of her hopes for a new life. Someone had intercepted her correspondence and at the same time sent her false responses in his name. She read her words as if they were from a stranger. "Esteemed Señor Herrera, I received your kind proposal through Don Carlos of Puebla, and I must confess that I was interested in the possibility of a simpler life, away from the complications of the city." Each line made her remember the emotions she had deposited in those pages, the cautious hope, the fear of exposing herself too much, the gradual opening of her heart as Santiago's supposed responses encouraged her to be more personal, more vulnerable. With slightly trembling hands, Melissa opened one of her own letters, the first she had sent, still shy and formal. "How cruel," she murmured to herself, feeling simultaneously deceived and ashamed for having believed so easily in a fantasy constructed by a stranger. "Did you find something interesting?" Doña Refugio's voice made her startle. The elderly woman was standing in the pantry doorway, leaning on the doorframe, firmer than in previous days. "My letters," said Melissa, showing her the bundle. "They're all here, unopened. Santiago never read them." Doña Refugio nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. "My son didn't know how to answer letters," she said simply, "but he knew how to recognize a sincere heart when he saw one." "What do you mean?" "Come, daughter, there's something you need to see." Doña Refugio led her to the bedroom, moving slowly but with surprising determination. Beside the bed, she indicated a loose board in the wooden floor. "Lift it," she said. Melissa knelt and raised the board, revealing a small compartment excavated in the compacted earth. Inside was a rusty metal box and some objects wrapped in oiled cloth. "Santiago asked me to show this only if something happened to him, or if the right person arrived, explained Doña Refugio. I believe you are the right person. With reverent care, Melissa removed the objects from the hiding place. The first package contained a dark blue military jacket, with faded golden epaulets and buttons engraved with the Republican eagle. There were also campaign medals and an insignia that identified Santiago as a veteran of the forces that had fought the French intervention. The second package revealed a sepia photograph, slightly yellowed by the years. It showed a young man in military uniform, clearly Santiago by the features Melissa could recognize in Doña Refugio's bone structure, next to a girl in a white dress, with long hair braided with flowers. Both smiled with the carefree joy of youth. "Is it him?" asked Melissa, pointing to the young soldier. "Yes. And she was Luz, my youngest daughter." Melissa studied the face of the young woman in the photograph. There was a resemblance to Santiago, but also a particular delicacy, a light in her eyes that suggested dreams too big for a small place. "She was very beautiful," said Melissa gently. "She was intelligent too. She wanted to be a teacher, to teach the children of the settlement. She said education was the only way to change people's destiny." The mention of education touched a sensitive chord in Melissa's heart. In Puebla, she had worked at a school for workers' daughters, teaching them to read and write in her spare time. It was work that gave her purpose, even when loneliness became almost unbearable. What happened to her? Doña Refugio closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to relive painful memories. She became gravely ill, a fever that consumed her day and night. Santiago tried to bring a doctor from the city, but her voice broke. The justice of the peace, Don Beltran, wouldn't allow it. He said doctors were expensive, and that poor people should be content with prayers and home remedies. How can a judge prevent medical treatment? Don Beltran controlled everything here. He decided who could travel, who could trade with other cities, even who could receive correspondence. He charged taxes for everything, and if someone couldn't pay... Doña Refugio made a vague gesture. There was always a law that justified his decision. Melissa began to understand the labyrinth of power and corruption that had shaped the tragedy of the Herrera family. In small and isolated places, men like this judge could exercise almost absolute power over entire lives. And Santiago, how did he react? He was like a man possessed. After Luz, after she departed, he couldn't stay still. He said there were injustices in the world that couldn't be accepted in silence. Doña Refugio looked at the photograph with an expression of infinite longing. One morning, he simply left. He left a note saying he needed to find a place where he could breathe without feeling anger. The metal box contained still other treasures, letters from war companions, an outdated map of the region, and a surprise that made Melissa's heart race, a bundle of sheets written in elegant feminine handwriting. "What is this?" she asked, showing the sheets. Doña Refugio sighed deeply. Letters that arrived for Santiago after he departed, from a woman from Guadalajara. And, well, also from you. Melissa quickly leafed through the pages. There were letters from at least 3 different women, all addressing Santiago as if they maintained regular correspondence with him. One from Guadalajara, one from Monterrey, and her own letters from Puebla. The responses she had sent to Santiago's false letters. "Someone was impersonating Santiago to deceive several women," said Melissa, feeling a mixture of indignation and embarrassment. "Yes," confirmed Doña Refugio. "And I know who." Before she could reveal the name, the sound of footsteps in the yard made both turn to the window. An elegantly dressed woman was walking toward the house, followed by a middle-aged man in formal attire. "Mercedes," murmured Doña Refugio, and there was a note of alarm in her voice that made Melissa instinctively prepare for confrontation. The woman approaching was tall and slender, with black hair pulled in elaborate hairstyle, and a fine fabric dress in dark green tone. Her eyes, even at a distance, shone with an intensity that could be passion or calculation. She walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed and admired. "Hide everything," whispered Doña Refugio urgently. Quickly, Melissa replaced the objects in the hiding place and repositioned the board while Doña Refugio hurried back to bed, feigning greater weakness than she actually felt. When the door opened without ceremony, Melissa was standing at the bedroom entrance, partially blocking the view of the house's interior. "Do you enter other people's houses like this?" she asked coldly. Mercedes stopped, clearly not expecting to find resistance. Her green eyes made a quick assessment of Melissa, cataloguing every detail of her appearance with the precision of a merchant examining merchandise. "You must be the woman from Puebla," said Mercedes with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The one Santiago sent for." The way she pronounced the words carried an unpleasant insinuation, as if Melissa were an object ordered by correspondence. "I'm Melissa Soledad," she replied with dignity. "And you are?" "Mercedes Villarreal, and I have some matters to discuss with you." The man accompanying her stepped forward. He was corpulent, with a carefully waxed mustache and clothes that indicated elevated social position. His small eyes examined Melissa with a disapproval he didn't bother to disguise. "I'm Don Ignacio Vega, mayor of this community for 20 years, he said with a pompous voice, "and I need to inform you that your presence here raises certain legal questions." Melissa felt the ground becoming unstable under her feet, but kept her voice firm. "What kind of questions?" "Well, it's simple," said Mercedes, entering the house without invitation and looking around as if evaluating properties. "Santiago promised me this house. We have a commitment of years. You, being a stranger without ties to the family, have no right to be here." The words fell upon Melissa like stones. Another revelation, another layer of deception unfolding. How many women had Santiago invited? How many promises had been made in his name? "I have letters," said Melissa, raising her chin. "Letters that specifically invite me to this house." Mercedes laughed, a crystalline and cruel sound. "Ah, the famous letters. I also have mine, dear, and with dates well before yours." The situation was becoming increasingly surreal. There were two women, both deceived, both attracted to the same place by false promises, now disputing the remains of a fantasy that had never existed. "Ladies," intervened Don Ignacio, evidently uncomfortable with the growing tension, "I suggest you resolve this matter civilly. Perhaps it would be better if both considered leaving and letting Doña Refugio under the community's care." "No," said Melissa, with a firmness that surprised her. "I won't abandon a sick woman just because the situation got complicated." Mercedes studied her with narrowed eyes, as if re-evaluating her adversary. "How noble," she said with sarcasm. "But nobility doesn't pay debts or resolve property questions. This house has an owner, and it's not you." At that moment, Doña Refugio's weak voice was heard from the room. "Mercedes Villarreal, this house is mine while I live. And Melissa stays as long as I want." Mercedes's face contracted in an expression of controlled anger, but she didn't retort. There was something in the elderly woman's authority that even she didn't dare challenge openly. "We'll see," she said finally, heading for the door. "We'll see for how long." When they left, Melissa sat heavily in the chair beside Doña Refugio's bed, feeling as if she had survived a storm. "Now you're going to tell me everything," she said. "Who is Mercedes? Why does she claim to have rights over this house? And who the devil was writing false letters in Santiago's name?" Doña Refugio closed her eyes, seeming suddenly much older. "It's a long story, daughter. A story of ambition, manipulation, and a heart that was broken before learning to love truly." "I have time," said Melissa. "And after what just happened, I believe I have the right to know." And so while the sun moved slowly across the Mexican sky, Doña Refugio began to reveal the secrets that had shaped the destiny of San Jacinto del Nogal. Secrets that would explain not only the false letters and empty promises, but also why a man had fled home one dawn, leaving behind everything he loved. Doña Refugio's story began like a thread, pulled from a complex fabric, gradually revealing the hidden design behind the events that had led Melissa there. "Mercedes arrived in San Jacinto 5 years ago," began the elderly woman, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if memories were projected there like shadows. "She came fleeing from some scandal in Guadalajara. We never knew exactly what, but a woman alone, beautiful, with expensive clothes and no family. Well, that generates conversations." Melissa settled better in the chair, realizing she would finally begin to understand the labyrinth she had gotten into. Santiago was different at that time. He had returned from the war 3 years earlier, but still carried wounds that wouldn't heal. Not wounds of the body, those he had overcome, wounds of the soul. He had seen men die for ideals, had fought for the Republic, and when it all ended, he returned home and found this. Doña Refugio gestured, encompassing the poor house, the forgotten settlement, the simple life that seemed too small for a man who had known the immensity of battlefields. Mercedes perceived this in him. She had a special talent for identifying lost men, men who needed to feel important again. The elderly woman's voice gained a note of bitterness. She approached slowly, with careful compliments, with questions about the war that made Santiago feel like the hero he had been. Melissa imagined the scene, the ex-soldier, still young but already marked by experience, finding in a sophisticated woman the possibility of feeling worthy of admiration again. And Luz? How did she relate to Mercedes? My daughter never liked her. She said Mercedes looked at people as if they were pieces in a game, only she knew the rules. Doña Refugio smiled sadly. Luz was intuitive that way. She saw through appearances. Did Mercedes and Santiago get involved? For a few months, yes. She came here frequently, always with small but elegant gifts, a silk scarf, a perfume bottle, things that showed her superiority over local women. Doña Refugio paused. Santiago felt important beside her, as if she elevated him above the common life he led. But something happened. Mercedes began making plans. She wanted Santiago to sell this house, for us to leave the settlement. She said he deserved a better life in a big city where his talents would be recognized. The elderly woman coughed lightly. But when Luz became ill, Mercedes disappeared. She said she needed to visit relatives in Monterrey and left just when we most needed support. The image of Mercedes was completing in Melissa's mind, a woman who approached men when they could be useful to her, but who fled when real difficulties arose. Santiago was devastated, not only by Luz's illness, but by understanding he had been deceived about Mercedes. When she returned after we lost Luz, he didn't want to see her anymore. And it was then that he left? Not immediately. First there was the confrontation with Don Beltran, the judge. Santiago was disturbed with rage and pain. He said some harsh words about justice and corruption that reached the ears of important people. Doña Refugio looked at Melissa meaningfully. Don Beltran was Don Ignacio's brother-in-law, the man who came here today. They controlled the settlement like a private fief. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together. And Mercedes. Mercedes is intelligent. She realized Santiago would never accept her again, but she also realized he had become a threat to the powerful people of the settlement. It was then that she began to, let's say, collaborate with them. Collaborate how? It was she who began intercepting the correspondence that arrived for Santiago after he left. It was she who discovered that lonely women from other cities sent letters to him, offering themselves for marriage by proxy or similar arrangements. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine, and she responded in his name. Exactly. Mercedes has elegant handwriting and sufficient education to write convincing letters. She deceived you, deceived others, always with Don Ignacio's help, who controlled the postal agency. But why do this? What was the objective? Doña Refugio hesitated, as if the next revelation was particularly painful. Mercedes wants this property, not for the house, which as you see isn't worth much, but for the location. This land is at the highest point of the settlement, with a view of all the roads that arrive here. Don Beltran, before dying, had promised her he would build a large house here, worthy of her social position. Don Beltran died. Last autumn. Heart attack, they say. But he left many things in progress, many plans that Mercedes intended to see fulfilled. The elderly woman held Melissa's hand, including the plan to transfer me to the church asylum, freeing this property. The coldness of the scheme left Melissa horrified. So the letters were a way to attract desperate women who would be stranded here when they discovered the truth. Yes, Mercedes calculated that you would simply leave, humiliated and defeated. She never imagined someone would stay to care for a sick old woman. Melissa got up and walked to the window, looking at the settlement that extended below. How many other women had been deceived? How many had made the journey full of hopes, only to discover everything was nothing but cruel manipulation? There's something more, said Doña Refugio quietly. Something I discovered a few days ago, going through Santiago's papers. She indicated a drawer of the small dresser beside the bed. Melissa opened it and found a bundle of letters tied with red ribbon. They're from Mercedes to Don Beltran. Santiago found them in the judge's house after he died. They were on top of the table, as if he was reading when he had the heart attack. Melissa opened one of the letters, dated only 3 months earlier. The handwriting was the same she had seen in the supposed letters from Santiago. Her eyes quickly scanned the content, and with each line her indignation grew. "Dear Beltran," read a passage. "The plan with the letters is working better than we expected. I've already intercepted correspondence from 4 different women. The one from Puebla seems particularly vulnerable, a desperate spinster who will believe any promise of marriage. When she arrives and discovers the truth, she'll be so humiliated she'll leave immediately." "How evil," murmured Melissa, feeling exposed and wounded by the casual cruelty of the words. "There's more," said Doña Refugio. "Keep reading. With old Refugio getting weaker and weaker, soon we can accelerate her transfer to the asylum. The property will be free for us to build the house we so desire. Don Ignacio has already prepared the necessary documents, alleging abandonment of the property. Our future is almost within reach, my love." Melissa sat down abruptly, the letters falling from her trembling hands. Mercedes and Don Beltran were lovers. Yes, and apparently they planned to marry as soon as they got this property and built a house worthy of their ambitions. But he died, yes. And now Mercedes wants to execute the plans alone. That's why she brought Don Ignacio today, to continue legal pressure on you and me. The scope of the conspiracy left Melissa stunned. She hadn't been the victim of just a romantic deception, but of an elaborate scheme involving corruption, manipulation, and greed. Mercedes had played with the feelings of desperate women like one who moves pieces on a chessboard. "And now?" she finally asked. "Now, daughter, you have a choice to make." Doña Refugio sat up in bed, supporting herself on her elbows. "You can leave, as Mercedes expects you to do, or you can stay and fight." "Fight how? I don't have money for lawyers. I don't know anyone here. I have no influence." "You have something more powerful than all that," said the elderly woman with a gleam in her eyes. "You have the truth. And you have a heart that doesn't give up on those who need help." At that moment, as if summoned by the conversation, Mercedes's footsteps echoed again in the yard. This time she came alone, walking with the determination of someone who had come for a final confrontation. "She's back," murmured Melissa. "Yes, and this time I believe she won't come with polite words." Doña Refugio squeezed Melissa's hand. "Remember, you're not the desperate woman she thought she would find. You're stronger than you imagine." When Mercedes entered through the door without knocking, her eyes shone with cold determination. She had abandoned any pretense of courtesy. "We came to talk like civilized people," she said without preamble. "Your presence here is becoming inconvenient." "Inconvenient for whom?" retorted Melissa, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "For all of us. You're a foreigner without rights, caring for an old woman who should be under proper care." Mercedes gestured toward Doña Refugio. "There's a place at the church asylum where she would be better attended." "I'm not going anywhere," said Doña Refugio, with an energy that belied her apparent fragility. "This is my house." Mercedes ignored her completely, addressing only Melissa. "I can make your life very difficult here. Don Ignacio has authority to question you about your illegal stay. I can make the merchants refuse to sell you anything. I can—" She made a dramatic pause. "I can reveal to the entire settlement exactly how you arrived here. A desperate spinster, deceived by false letters, offering herself to a man who didn't even know of her existence." The threat was like a slap, but Melissa discovered she had passed the point where humiliation paralyzed her. "Do what you want," she said calmly. "But I won't abandon Doña Refugio." Mercedes studied her with narrowed eyes, clearly not expecting resistance. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said finally. "Actually," replied Melissa, getting up and walking toward the dresser where Mercedes's letters to the dead judge were, "I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with." And when she showed Mercedes her own letters to Don Beltran, when she saw the woman's face pale before her own words written in black and white, Melissa understood that the war had truly begun. But she also understood that, for the first time in her life, she wouldn't flee from a fight. The confrontation with Mercedes had left the air in the small house charged with tension, like the heavy atmosphere that precedes desert storms. Melissa remained standing beside the dresser, holding the incriminating letters, while Mercedes stared at her with a mixture of rage and calculation that made her green eyes shine like cutting gemstones. Where did you find this? Mercedes's voice came out controlled, but Melissa perceived the almost imperceptible tremor that betrayed her nervousness. In Don Beltran's house, after he died, replied Melissa. Without mentioning it had been Santiago who found them. They were on top of his work table. Mercedes walked slowly through the room, her skirts rustling against the irregular wooden floor. Each movement was calculated, as if she were mentally reorganizing her strategies. Those letters prove nothing beyond an intimate friendship, she said finally. Nothing illegal. They prove conspiracy to deceive innocent women and illegally appropriate properties, retorted Melissa, with a firmness she herself didn't know she possessed. Mercedes laughed, but the sound had no joy. It was cold like the wind that descended from the mountains at dusk. You really believe someone in this settlement will care about the love letters of a woman who died 2 months ago? She approached Melissa, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. Don Beltran was respected here. I am respected here. You are nobody. Doña Refugio, who had remained silent during the exchange, cleared her throat softly. Mercedes, dear, she said with a tranquility that contrasted with the tension in the air. There's something else you should know. The woman turned to the elderly woman with barely disguised impatience. Santiago didn't leave only out of pain or anger, continued Doña Refugio. He left because he discovered something about Don Beltran's death. Mercedes's face paled slightly, but she maintained her posture. Don Beltran had a heart attack. Everyone knows that. Yes, agreed Doña Refugio, but no one asked what caused that heart attack, what he was doing, what he was reading when he died. Melissa observed the two women, realizing she was watching a verbal duel whose rules she still didn't fully understand. Santiago found more than those letters in the judge's house, continued the elderly woman. He also found an official document, signed but not dated, transferring the ownership of this house to you, Mercedes. A document Don Beltran had prepared for when I died, or was declared incapable of caring for my property. Mercedes contracted slightly, as if she had received an unexpected blow. I don't know what you're talking about. He also found correspondence between Don Beltran and a lawyer from Monterrey, discussing legal ways to accelerate my transfer to the church asylum. Doña Refugio sat up more in bed, her faded blue eyes gaining surprising intensity. And a letter from you, my dear, suggesting specific methods to make my life here more difficult. The silence that followed was dense, like still water. Melissa felt her heart beating strongly, while she understood the extent of the evil that had been planned against the defenseless elderly woman. Where are those documents? Mercedes's voice came out higher than she intended. In a safe place, replied Doña Refugio simply. Mercedes studied her for a long moment, then turned to Melissa with a look that mixed contempt and something close to reluctant respect. You have no idea what you're defending, she said. This old woman isn't the defenseless saint she appears to be. What does that mean? Asked Melissa. It means, said Mercedes, heading toward the door, that there are secrets in this house that neither you nor I know completely. After she left, leaving behind only the echo of her veiled threats, Melissa sat beside Doña Refugio with the feeling that each answer obtained generated 2 new questions. Is it true? Did Santiago really find those documents? Doña Refugio sighed deeply, seeming suddenly very tired. Yes and no, daughter. Santiago found the letters you saw. But the other documents, well, let's say Mercedes isn't the only person in this house who knows how to keep secrets. What do you mean by that? I mean, there are things hidden here that not even Santiago knows. Things I've kept for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Doña Refugio indicated a loose stone in the wall behind the bed. It was larger than the hiding place in the floor and had been camouflaged so carefully that Melissa had never noticed it. Remove that stone, said the elderly woman. Melissa obeyed, discovering a considerable compartment excavated in the adobe wall. Inside was a carved wooden box, well preserved, and some objects wrapped in oiled cloth. This was my husband's inheritance, explained Doña Refugio. He was the town hall clerk before Don Ignacio assumed the position. He kept copies of all important documents that passed through his hands. Melissa carefully opened the box. It was full of papers organized by dates, some up to 20 years old. There were purchase and sale contracts, birth and death certificates, tax records, a complete chronicle of the official life of San Jacinto del Nogal. Why keep all this? My husband said that one day this information would be necessary, that men like Don Beltran and Don Ignacio would leave traces of their corruption, and that only official documents could bring them down. Doña Refugio smiled sadly. He died before he could use this information, but he made me promise I would keep it. Melissa leafed through the documents, impressed with the meticulousness of Doña Refugio's late husband. There were records of illegal taxes charged by Don Ignacio, of properties fraudulently transferred, of manipulated elections. This is a gold mine, she murmured, understanding the explosive power of that information. Yes, and now you understand why Mercedes wants this property so much. It's not just for the location. It's because she suspects there's something here that can compromise her and her allies. Does she know about these documents? She suspects. Don Beltran mentioned once in a conversation she overheard about old papers that could be problematic, but he never managed to discover where they were hidden. Melissa continued examining the documents until she found something that made her stop abruptly. It was a birth certificate, Mercedes Villarreal's. But the father's name listed wasn't what she expected. Doña Refugio, she said slowly. Mercedes is Don Beltran's daughter. The elderly woman nodded gravely. Yes, illegitimate daughter, born from a relationship he had with a young woman from Guadalajara, when he was still a public prosecutor. Mercedes's mother died when she was a teenager, and Don Beltran brought her here, but never recognized her publicly. The revelation completely changed Melissa's perspective on Mercedes. She wasn't just an ambitious woman trying to take advantage of a powerful man. She was a daughter trying to conquer the recognition and inheritance that had always been denied her. That's why she wanted this property, not just to build a large house, but to establish her position in the community. Exactly. As Don Beltran's unrecognized daughter, she was always seen as an elegant intruder, tolerated, but never truly accepted. If she could get this property and build an imposing house here, she would finally have the status she always desired. Melissa felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for Mercedes, mixed with her indignation about the methods she had chosen. But that doesn't justify deceiving innocent women. No, agreed Doña Refugio, it doesn't justify, but it helps explain. At that moment, the sound of horses approaching made both look through the window. 2 men on horseback were heading toward the house. Don Ignacio and another man Melissa didn't recognize, younger and wearing dusty traveling clothes. More problems coming, murmured Doña Refugio. But when the younger man dismounted and Melissa saw his face clearly, her heart almost stopped. It was Santiago Herrera, thinner and marked by time, but unmistakably the man from the photographs she had found. My son has returned, whispered Doña Refugio, and there was in her voice a mixture of relief and apprehension that made Melissa understand that Santiago's arrival would change everything, for better or worse. Santiago walked toward the house with hesitant steps, as if each meter brought him closer to ghosts he had tried to leave behind. His eyes, when they met Melissa's through the window, widened in surprise. Who is that woman? Melissa heard him ask Don Ignacio. It's precisely about her that we want to talk to you, replied the mayor with a smile that didn't inspire confidence. And so, after months of mystery and weeks of disturbing discoveries, Melissa was finally about to meet the man in whose name her life had been turned upside down. The question was, would he be an ally in the fight against the corruption she had discovered, or another piece in the complex power game that controlled San Jacinto del Nogal? The answer would come in a few minutes, when Santiago Herrera crossed that door and discovered that a stranger had changed his life as much as he had changed hers, without either of them having consciously chosen that destiny. Santiago Herrera stopped at the threshold, like a man returning to a dream that had transformed into something unrecognizable. His eyes, of a deep brown that reminded of earth after rain, quickly scanned the interior of the house, cataloguing changes, the clean curtains in the window, the smell of medicinal herbs instead of the odor of abandonment he had left behind, and especially the presence of an unknown woman who observed him with an expression that mixed curiosity and defiance. Melissa had a few seconds to study him before he spoke. Santiago was shorter than she had imagined, but there was in his posture a natural dignity that compensated for the lack of stature. His dark hair was longer, touching his shoulders, and an unkempt beard covered his angular face. His clothes, white cotton shirt, leather pants, and worn boots, showed signs of long travel but were clean, suggesting he had made some effort to present himself decently. "Mama," he said simply, going directly to Doña Refugio without taking his eyes off Melissa. The elderly woman extended her hands tremblingly, and Santiago took them in his, kneeling beside the bed. For a moment, mother and son remained silent, communicating through touch and looks that carried months of separation and longing. "You're better," observed Santiago, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "I've had care," replied Doña Refugio, looking meaningfully at Melissa. "This is Melissa Soledad from Puebla." Santiago turned to her, and Melissa saw in his eyes a confusion that mirrored her own. "You wrote letters," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of something he didn't understand. "Yes," replied Melissa simply, "and you responded." "No." The denial was immediate and categorical. "I never responded to any letter. I can barely write my own name." Don Ignacio, who had remained silent at the door, cleared his throat sonorously. "It's precisely about this that we need to talk, Santiago. This situation is becoming problematic for the entire community." Santiago slowly stood up, and Melissa realized he was evaluating not only her presence, but the dynamics between all the people present. There was in his movements the caution of a man who had learned to distrust others' motivations. "What kind of problem?" he asked. "Señorita Soledad is occupying your property without legal authorization," said Don Ignacio, puffing his chest with the importance of his official position. "I have municipal authority to resolve issues of irregular possession." "This isn't my property," replied Santiago calmly. "It's my mother's." Yes, of course. But the issue is that the señorita is here under false pretenses, believing she had been invited by you through fraudulent correspondence." Santiago looked again at Melissa, this time with a tension that made her feel simultaneously examined and understood. "You believed you were coming to marry me." It wasn't a question, but Melissa nodded, feeling the blush rise up her neck. "The letters were very convincing," she said, raising her chin with dignity. "Whoever wrote them knew details about you and your family." "Mercedes," said Santiago simply, as if that single word explained everything. Don Ignacio shifted uncomfortably. "There's no proof that Señorita Villarreal has any involvement with this confusion, and even if there were, the fact remains, Señorita Soledad has no legal rights over this property." Santiago walked to the window, looking at the settlement that extended below. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from very deep places. "Don Ignacio, you have been looking for me since I returned. Why?" The mayor hesitated, clearly not expecting the direct question. "There are pending administrative issues. Your sudden departure left certain documentations open." "What documentations?" "Well, overdue taxes, property fees, fines for abandonment of cultivable land." Don Ignacio took a paper from his jacket's inner pocket. "The total amount, with interest and corrections, reaches a considerable sum." Santiago extended his hand for the document, but couldn't read it, confirming his statement about limitations with writing. Melissa, without being asked, approached and examined the paper. "This is absurd," she said immediately. "These taxes are 3 times higher than the property's market value, and some of these fines are for laws that don't even exist." Don Ignacio looked at her with barely disguised irritation. "Is the señorita an expert in Mexican municipal laws?" "No," replied Melissa firmly. "But I know how to read, and I know how to recognize extortion when I see it." The silence that followed was tense. Santiago looked at Melissa with something that could have been growing respect, then turned to Don Ignacio. "How much time do I have to pay these taxes?" "Normally it would be 30 days, but given the special circumstances—" Don Ignacio made a dramatic pause. "We can resolve everything immediately if you agree to transfer the property to someone capable of maintaining it adequately." "Someone like Mercedes Villarreal?" Santiago's voice was dangerously low. "Señorita Villarreal has the resources and social position necessary to enhance this property," replied Don Ignacio pompously. "It would be a beneficial solution for everyone." Santiago walked slowly until he was very close to the mayor. Although he was shorter, there was something in his presence that made Don Ignacio instinctively step back. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll have to apply the law. The property will be confiscated for debts and you and your mother will have to find another place to live." Doña Refugio, who had remained silent during the entire exchange, coughed lightly. "Santiago," she said calmly, "perhaps it's time to show Don Ignacio the documents you found in Don Beltran's house." The mayor's face paled slightly. "What documents?" "Interesting correspondence," said Santiago, going to the dresser and taking out the letters Melissa had seen earlier. Letters between Don Beltran and Mercedes discussing methods to accelerate certain property transfers. Don Ignacio extended his hand, but Santiago didn't give him the letters. "I also found records of irregular payments made by Mercedes to Don Beltran, substantial amounts, always coinciding with judicial decisions favorable to her." "Those are just speculations," stammered Don Ignacio, "without legal value." "Perhaps," agreed Santiago, "but I'm sure the federal authorities in Monterrey would find it interesting to examine these documents, along with the records my mother kept of all administrative irregularities committed here in the last 20 years. The mention of the secret records was like a precise blow. Don Ignacio looked at Doña Refugio with an expression that mixed fear and fury. "You can't prove anything." "We can try," said Melissa, surprising everyone, including herself with her intervention. "There are lawyers in Monterrey who specialize in municipal corruption cases, especially when there's documentary evidence." Santiago looked at her with something close to amazement. It was clear he didn't expect support from a stranger, especially from someone who had been deceived using his name. Don Ignacio realized he had lost control of the situation. He put away the document about the supposed debts and headed for the door, but stopped at the threshold. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Mercedes Villarreal isn't a woman who accepts defeats easily. And she has resources you can't imagine." After he left, the three remained silent for several minutes. Finally, Santiago turned to Melissa. "Why did you defend me? You don't know me. You have every reason to hate me for the deception you suffered." Melissa considered the question carefully before responding. "Because I learned in these last weeks that there's a difference between people who hurt others out of weakness and those who do it out of malice. You may have caused pain indirectly, but not by your own choice." Santiago nodded slowly, as if absorbing not only her words, but the philosophy behind them. "And now?" he asked. "Will you return to Puebla?" Melissa looked at Doña Refugio, who observed her with silent expectation, then at Santiago, whose eyes carried a vulnerability he was trying to hide. "I haven't decided yet," she said finally. "But while I'm here, I intend to help you fight this injustice." It was a declaration of war and everyone present knew it. Mercedes and her allies wouldn't accept defeat passively, and Santiago's presence complicated the situation even more. But for the first time since her arrival in San Jacinto del Nogal, Melissa felt she wasn't facing adversities alone. The question was, would Santiago be the ally she had begun to hope for, or would his return bring complications that would make the fight even more difficult? The answer would come soon, because Mercedes had certainly already been informed of his return, and a woman with the resources and determination she had demonstrated wouldn't allow her victory to be snatched without a final battle. Night fell over San Jacinto del Nogal like a heavy blanket, bringing with it cold winds that whispered between the adobe houses and made the flames of candles tremble in windows. Melissa had prepared a simple dinner with the ingredients she had managed to buy, refried beans, warm tortillas, and chamomile tea, but the tension in the small house made each bite difficult to swallow. Santiago ate in silence, sitting on a chair he had improvised with loose boards and ropes. His hands, Melissa noticed, had new calluses, not the old calluses of a man who worked the land, but recent marks that suggested different activities, perhaps craftsmanship or construction. Where had he been during those months? What had he done to survive? "Son," said Doña Refugio, breaking the silence, "tell us where you've been." Santiago raised his eyes from his plate, and Melissa saw in them an internal struggle between the desire to share and the habit of keeping secrets. "I went north," he said finally. "I crossed the desert until I reached the silver mines near Chihuahua. I worked there for a few months." "In the mines?" The surprise in Doña Refugio's voice was genuine. "No, making tools for the miners. I discovered I had a knack for working iron." He showed his marked hands. "An old blacksmith taught me the trade. He said I had skillful hands and enough patience." Melissa observed how his eyes lit up slightly when talking about the work. It was the first time she saw him show any enthusiasm since he had arrived. "Why did you come back?" she asked gently. Santiago remained silent for so long that Melissa began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Because a man can't run from himself forever," he said finally. "And because I started having dreams." "Dreams?" "With Luz. She would come visit me in dreams and tell me our mother was alone and needing care." He looked at Doña Refugio with tenderness. "That there was a good woman caring for her, but that this woman also needed protection." Melissa felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea that Santiago had returned in response to some kind of premonition or spiritual calling gave her a strange sense of inevitable destiny. "And when you arrived here you found exactly that," observed Doña Refugio with a half-smile. "Yes." Santiago looked at Melissa with an expression she couldn't completely decipher. "I found a good woman caring for you. A woman who was being deceived and attacked by unscrupulous people, but who didn't flee even when she discovered the truth." The compliment made Melissa blush slightly, but she kept her gaze steady. "I still don't completely understand why I stayed," she admitted. "Maybe because in Puebla I was empty, living just to live. Here, even with all the problems, I feel I have a purpose." Santiago nodded as if he understood the feeling perfectly. "That's how I felt when I learned to work iron. For the first time since the war, I felt I was creating something instead of just destroying or fleeing." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horse hooves approaching rapidly. All three tensed, and Santiago got up, moving toward the window with the caution of a man accustomed to expecting trouble. "It's Mercedes," he said quietly. "She's coming alone." Melissa felt her stomach tighten. A Mercedes alone, at night, could be more dangerous than a Mercedes accompanied by authorities during the day. The door opened without ceremony, and Mercedes entered like a contained storm. Her clothes were impeccable as always, but there was something wild in her green eyes that suggested a woman near the limit of her patience. "Santiago," she said without greeting anyone else, "we need to talk." "Hello, Mercedes." His voice was neutral, polite but cold. "How are you?" "How am I?" She laughed, a sound without humor. "I'm trying to understand why you came back just now, when everything was finally resolving itself." "Resolving for whom?" Mercedes looked quickly at Melissa and Doña Refugio, clearly bothered by their presence. "Can we talk privately?" "No," said Santiago simply. "Anything you have to tell me can be said in front of them." Mercedes breathed deeply, visibly recomposing herself. When she spoke again, her voice had recovered the controlled and melodious tone that Melissa had already learned to distrust. "Very well. Santiago, you know I always cared about you. When you left I was worried. I tried to care for your mother in the best way I could." Doña Refugio made a sound that could have been a bitter laugh, but disguised it by coughing. "I never saw you here, Mercedes," said Santiago. "Well, there were other ways to help. Administrative. I ensured there were no bureaucratic problems with the property. You ensured there were no problems or created problems that only you could solve." Santiago's question was asked with deadly tranquility. Mercedes hesitated for a fraction of a second, enough time to confirm everyone's suspicions. "I don't know what you're talking about." Santiago went to the dresser and took out the letters he had found in Don Beltran's house. He extended them to Mercedes, who paled upon recognizing her own handwriting. "Your letters to Beltran," he said simply, "very detailed." Mercedes didn't try to deny. Instead, she raised her chin defiantly. "So what? Beltran and I were close. There's no crime in private correspondence." "No, but there is crime in document falsification, in conspiracy to illegally appropriate properties, and in exploitation of vulnerable women." Santiago kept his voice low, but there was a firmness in it that made Mercedes step back half a step. "You can't prove any of that. I can try, and even if I can't, I can ensure the entire region knows exactly what kind of person you are." For a moment, Melissa thought Mercedes would flee or collapse. Instead, the woman seemed to gather strength from some deep and dangerous place. "Fine," she said, her voice gaining a cutting quality. "Let's speak clearly. Yes, I wrote letters in your name. Yes, I planned to take over this property. And do you know why?" She approached Santiago, and Melissa saw in her green eyes an almost feverish gleam. Because you're a coward. Because when things got difficult, you ran away. You left your sick mother, left your community, left people who cared about you. People like you? Santiago's voice carried bitter irony. Yes, like me. Mercedes's composure finally broke. I loved you, Santiago. When you were just a lost soldier trying to find your place in the world, I saw your potential. I wanted to build something with you, something big and important. Something that served your ambitions. And why not? Why should we be content with this miserable life in a forgotten settlement when we could have more? Mercedes gestured toward the peeling walls of the house. I offered love, social position, a future. You chose this. Melissa watched the scene with growing fascination. It was like watching the collapse of a dream that had been built on rotten foundations. And when Luz became ill, where was your love? Santiago's question was formulated with a quietness that was more devastating than any scream. Mercedes contracted as if she had been physically struck. Luz was dying, she said quietly. There was nothing I could do. You could have stayed. You could have offered support, comfort, human presence. Instead, you fled to Monterrey because death and suffering didn't match your elegant plans. I came back. You came back when the danger had passed, when you thought I would be vulnerable enough to accept any crumb of affection you offered me. Mercedes looked around the room, her eyes passing over Doña Refugio and stopping at Melissa. And now, will you choose this? This spinster schoolteacher who was stupid enough to believe false letters? The insult hit Melissa like a slap, but it was Santiago who responded, his voice gaining a dangerous edge. Melissa Soledad is worth 10 of you, Mercedes. She stayed caring for a sick stranger when you couldn't even visit the family of the man you supposedly loved. Oh, how romantic! Mercedes laughed with genuine bitterness. The wounded hero falls in love with the devoted nurse. What a touching story. Stop! Melissa's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood slowly, moving to face Mercedes. Stop now. There was something in her posture, in her voice, that made even Mercedes fall silent. You want to know why I stayed? It wasn't for Santiago, I didn't even know him. It wasn't for romance or hope of marriage. Those illusions died the day I arrived here. Melissa took a step toward Mercedes. I stayed because I found an elderly and sick woman who needed care, and because there was something inside me that couldn't abandon someone who needed help. How noble, said Mercedes sarcastically. It's not nobility. It's just basic humanity. Something you lost somewhere along the way between your ambitions and your schemes. Mercedes studied her for a long moment, and Melissa saw something changing in her eyes, perhaps an understanding that she had found a more formidable adversary than expected. You don't know this land, these people, these circumstances, Mercedes said finally. You don't know how to survive here when money runs out and harvests fail. Then teach me, replied Melissa calmly, or get out of the way and let me learn on my own. The challenge hanging in the air between the two women was almost tangible. Santiago and Doña Refugio watched like spectators of a duel that transcended any dispute over property or position. It was a battle between two completely different visions of how to live in the world. Mercedes headed for the door, but stopped at the threshold. This conversation isn't over, she said. None of you imagine the resources I have at my disposal. After she left, the silence in the house was profound. Finally, Santiago turned to Melissa. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For defending something you're not even sure you want. Melissa considered his words carefully. Maybe that's exactly why it's worth defending. And that night, while listening to Doña Refugio's regular breathing in the adjacent room and the night sounds of Santiago settling on a blanket on the living room floor, Melissa understood she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer a visitor in San Jacinto del Nogal. For better or worse, she had become part of the fight for the soul of that place. The question was, would this fight be worth the consequences that would certainly come? Dawn brought with it a fine rain that transformed the dirt streets of San Jacinto del Nogal into muddy streams. Melissa woke to the sound of drops hitting the straw roof and found Santiago already up in the kitchen, preparing coffee in a small dented metal pot. He moved with the efficient gestures of someone accustomed to caring for himself, but there was a restlessness in his movements that suggested a poorly slept night. Good morning, she said quietly, so as not to wake Doña Refugio. Good morning. Santiago served her a cup of the strong and bitter coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Not much." "And you?" He made a vague gesture that could mean anything. In the grey light of morning, Melissa could better study his face. There were lines around his eyes that weren't in the photographs, and a tension in his jaw that spoke of months carrying invisible weights. "May I ask something?" she said. Santiago nodded, leaning on the doorframe that led to the yard where the rain created small puddles between the dry plants. "Why did you come back exactly now? The story about dreams with Luz? Was it true?" He remained silent for so long that Melissa began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard yet. "Yes and no, I dreamed of Luz, that's true. But there was something else." He took a sip of coffee, making a face at the bitterness. "I received a letter." "A letter? From whom?" "From Don Esteban. It reached me through a complicated network. Miners who traveled, merchants who knew merchants. It took 2 months to find me." Melissa felt her stomach tighten. "What did the letter say?" "That a woman had arrived from Puebla saying she had been invited by me, that she was caring for my mother and refusing to leave even after discovering the letters were false." Santiago looked directly into her eyes. "Don Esteban wrote that there was something special about this woman, something that reminded him of Luz." The comparison made Melissa feel simultaneously honored and uncomfortable. He shouldn't have done that. "You were trying to restart your life. I was trying to run from my life," corrected Santiago. "There's a difference. And why were you running? Because of Luz? Because of Mercedes?" Santiago walked to the window, looking at the rain that slowly washed the dry earth. "Because of a decision I made the night Luz died. A decision that transformed me into a man I didn't recognize." Melissa waited, realizing she was about to hear something Santiago had never told anyone. "Don Beltran refused medical help for Luz because she was poor, because we couldn't pay his fees, and because he could. Because he had power and liked to exercise it over defenseless people." Santiago clenched his fists. "The night she died, I went to his house." Melissa's heart raced. "What did you do?" "I entered through the back door. He was alone, working on his papers, counting money as he always did after a day of extorting poor people." Santiago turned to her, and there was a darkness in his eyes that frightened her. "I carried a knife with me." "Santiago." "No, let me finish. I need someone to know." He approached her, his hands trembling slightly. "I stood there behind him for almost 10 minutes. He didn't even notice my presence. I could have done justice with my own hands. But you didn't." "No, because at the last moment I remembered what Luz always said, that violence only generates more violence, that the only way to defeat darkness is with light." Santiago laughed bitterly. "So I didn't kill him, but I took all the papers that were on his table, documents about corruption, illegal schemes, compromising correspondence. The papers you showed yesterday to Don Ignacio. Some of them, yes. Including the first letters from Mercedes planning to appropriate this property." Melissa slowly absorbed the information. "And Don Beltran? Did he see you?" "He woke up when I was leaving. He shouted, threatened me, said he would make me pay for invasion and theft." Santiago paused. 2 weeks later, he had the heart attack. "Do you think your invasion caused his death?" "I don't know. Maybe the stress of knowing there was evidence of his corruption. Maybe the worry that I could use those papers." He shook his head. "All I know is that I left because I couldn't distinguish between justice and revenge within my own heart." The confession explained much: the sudden flight, the reluctance to return, the darkness Melissa perceived in him. Santiago had carried alone the weight of an impossible moral decision. "And now, how do you feel about your choice?" "I still don't know. Part of me wishes I had had the courage to go through with it. Another part is glad I don't have blood on my hands." He looked at her with an intensity that made her step back. "What would you do, Melissa, if someone you loved died because of another person's gratuitous cruelty?" It was an impossible question, and Melissa knew any answer would be inadequate. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope I never have to find out." "I hope not. But now you know who I really am. A man who seriously considered committing murder, who stole private documents, who fled instead of facing the consequences of his actions." Melissa studied his face, seeing in it not the criminal he seemed to believe himself to be, but a man who had been broken by loss and was still trying to rebuild himself. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she said finally. Santiago shook his head. "I see a man who had the power to kill someone who deserved to die and chose not to do it. I see someone who, even consumed by pain, didn't completely lose his humanity. You don't understand. I wanted to kill him. For a moment I wanted that more than anything in the world. But you didn't, and that difference between wanting and doing is what defines who you really are." Santiago looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to assess the sincerity of her words. "Why are you being so understanding? You should be afraid of me." "Should I?" Melissa took a step toward him. "Santiago, I came here believing in false letters written by a woman who wanted to use me. I discovered I had been deceived, humiliated, turned into a piece in a cruel game. And do you know what I did?" "What?" "I stayed. Not because I'm noble or saintly, but because I found something here that was worth more than my wounded pride." She lightly touched his arm. "If I can understand my own capacity to forgive and move forward, I can understand a man who was tested beyond his limits and still chose the most difficult path." The words hung between them like a delicate bridge, offering possibilities neither had dared imagine. Santiago hesitantly extended his hand, touching Melissa's fingers with a tenderness that contrasted with the violence he had confessed to carrying in his heart. "Melissa," he said quietly, "I didn't want you to come. When Don Esteban wrote to me about you, my first reaction was panic. Not because I didn't want to meet you, but because I knew any woman good enough to care for my mother deserved something better than a haunted man like me. And now?" "Now," he hesitated, as if the next words were too precious to be said lightly. "Now, I wonder if maybe Luz was right about light conquering darkness. Maybe you're proof that there's still hope for someone like me." The moment was interrupted by Doña Refugio's weak voice calling from the room. Both turned, grateful for the interruption that saved them from navigating emotional waters they weren't yet prepared for. "Come here," said the elderly woman when they approached her bed. "There's something else you need to know, something that could change everything." Santiago and Melissa exchanged glances, wondering silently how many more secrets that small house still kept. "What is it, Mama?" Doña Refugio sat up in bed with effort, supporting herself on Santiago. Her faded blue eyes shone with a determination that contrasted with her physical fragility. "The woman in the photograph you found wasn't Luz." The silence that followed was dense like the atmosphere before a storm. "What do you mean?" asked Santiago slowly. "The girl in the photograph was Isabel, Mercedes' sister. She died 5 years ago, shortly after Mercedes arrived here." Melissa felt as if the ground was moving under her feet. Mercedes had a sister. Twin? Isabel was different from Mercedes. Sweet, gentle, really interested in helping people. Doña Refugio closed her eyes, as if the memory was painful. Mercedes brought her when she came here, but always treated Isabel as a burden. She said she was too simple to survive in the world. Santiago sat heavily in the chair beside the bed. "And what happened to her?" "Isabel fell in love with someone from the settlement. A young worker, poor but honest. But Mercedes was furious," said Isabel was lowering herself, "that she was ruining both their chances of ascending socially." "Who was the young man?" asked Melissa, although something deep inside her already knew the answer. "It was you, Santiago. Isabel fell in love with you." The revelation fell upon them like lightning. Santiago paled, his hands trembling slightly. I remember her. Isabel. She was shy, always smiled when she saw me on the street. But I never thought she was too shy to express her feelings, but Mercedes noticed, and decided that if Isabel couldn't have you, then she would. Melissa began to understand the complexity of the manipulation Mercedes had orchestrated. Mercedes approached Santiago to prevent him from becoming interested in Isabel. Exactly, and it worked. Santiago began courting her, and Isabel was heartbroken. "What happened to her?" Santiago's voice came out hoarse. "She became ill with sadness, literally. She stopped eating, stopped talking, wasted away each day. When she finally died, Mercedes told everyone it was fever, but I knew the truth." Santiago stood abruptly, walking to the window with agitated movements. "You're saying Isabel died because Mercedes manipulated me away from her?" I'm saying Mercedes chose her own interests over her own sister's happiness and life. Melissa felt a wave of nausea. Mercedes's cruelty was even deeper than she had imagined. And the photograph? Mercedes kept it as a trophy, perhaps, or a reminder of her victory. When Santiago left, she placed it among his belongings, maybe to confuse anyone who came looking for information. The puzzle was completing in a horrifying way. Mercedes wasn't just an ambitious woman. She was someone capable of sacrificing even family for her objectives. That's why she wants this property so much, murmured Melissa. It's not just ambition, it's completing something she started years ago. Santiago turned from the window, his face a mask of controlled rage. She destroyed Isabel to conquer me. When I was lost in grief over Luz and she realized I would never accept her again, she decided to destroy our family too. And now she's returned to finish what she started, added Doña Refugio. Remove me from this house, take control of the property, and finally build her empire in the place where two innocents suffered for her ambition. The magnitude of the evil Mercedes represented left everyone silent. It was no longer a question of property disputes or romantic rivalry. It was a battle between different visions of what it means to be human. What will we do? Asked Melissa finally. Santiago approached the bed, taking his mother's hands in his. We're going to expose the truth. All of it. Isabel deserves justice, even if posthumously. And how will we do that? With the documents we have, with testimonies from people who knew Isabel, and with... Santiago hesitated, as if weighing a difficult decision. With something else I haven't told you yet. Melissa looked at him questioningly. When I entered Don Beltran's house that night, I didn't just steal documents about corruption. I also found Isabel's diary, which Mercedes had given to the judge so he would destroy it. A diary? Isabel wrote everything. Her feelings for me, Mercedes's manipulations, including plans Mercedes had to permanently remove her from the way. The room became deadly silent. If the diary contained what Santiago suggested, Mercedes wasn't just cruel, she was potentially dangerous, in a way none of them had imagined. Where is the diary? Asked Doña Refugio. Hidden in a safe place. But bringing it to light means exposing not only Mercedes, but also my own invasion of Don Beltran's house. Would you be prosecuted? Asked Melissa. Possibly, but maybe that's the price I must pay for the justice Isabel never received. Melissa studied his face, seeing in it the same struggle she had witnessed earlier, a man torn between self-preservation and doing what was right. No, she said firmly, we won't expose you to unnecessary danger. There must be another way. How? Melissa walked to the window, watching the rain that gradually transformed the dusty settlement into something greener and more alive. An idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, but potentially effective. Mercedes doesn't know we know about Isabel, right? Right. Then we have an advantage. She still thinks she's controlling the situation. What are you suggesting? Melissa turned, a new determination burning in her eyes. I'm suggesting it's time for Mercedes Villarreal to discover what happens when she finally faces someone who refuses to be intimidated. And so, while the rain continued to fall over San Jacinto del Nogal, washing away the dust of old secrets, 3 people in a small house began to plan a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of a property, but the very soul of a community. The question remained, would it be possible to achieve justice without sacrificing innocence in the process? And was Melissa prepared for the consequences of challenging a woman who had already demonstrated she was capable of anything to get what she wanted? The answer would come soon enough, because Mercedes would not wait long before making her next move. The following morning brought with it a clear sky and fresh air that made the settlement seem renewed after the rain. Melissa woke with a determination she hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation of finally having a clear purpose and the necessary courage to pursue it. Santiago had left early to retrieve Isabel's diary from the location where he kept it hidden, a small cave in the mountains surrounding San Jacinto del Nogal. He had promised to return before noon, bringing with him the evidence that could finally expose the truth about Mercedes. While preparing breakfast for Doña Refugio, Melissa couldn't stop thinking about young Isabel, a woman who had died for loving the wrong man at the wrong time, victim of her own sister's manipulations. It was an injustice that cried out for reparation, even if belated. "Daughter," said Doña Refugio, watching her as she slowly ate her oatmeal porridge, "are you sure about what we're about to do?" "I am," replied Melissa without hesitation. "Isabel deserves for the truth to be known. And Santiago, are you prepared for the consequences this might bring for him?" The question made Melissa pause. The truth was that her feelings for Santiago had become more complicated than she had ever expected. It was no longer just compassion for a man who had suffered injustices. There was something deeper, something she wasn't yet ready to name. "Santiago is strong enough to face whatever comes," she said finally. "And he deserves a chance to finally be free from the guilt he has carried." Doña Refugio nodded slowly, but there was worry in her eyes. Mercedes won't surrender easily. When she realizes she has lost control of the situation, then we'll be ready for her. The sound of hooves approaching made both look toward the window. To their surprise, it was Don Esteban approaching the house, not Mercedes as they had expected. "Good morning, señoras," he said, dismounting with the careful grace of an advanced man. "May I enter?" "Of course, Don Esteban," replied Melissa, opening the door for him. The elderly man removed his hat, revealing white hair that was well combed, despite his early morning ride. "I came because there's news you need to hear," he said without preamble. "Mercedes left the settlement last night." Melissa and Doña Refugio exchanged glances. "Left? Where to?" "Monterrey, according to people who witnessed. She took 2 large trunks and paid a driver handsomely to transport her." "She's fleeing," murmured Melissa. "Maybe. Or perhaps she's going to gather resources for a final confrontation." Don Esteban accepted a cup of coffee Melissa offered. "But there's more. Before leaving, she visited several people in the settlement." "What kind of people?" "People with debts to Don Ignacio. People who depended on favors from Don Beltran when he was alive." Don Esteban took a sip of the bitter coffee. "She's building alliances, offering to pay debts in exchange for loyalty." Melissa felt her stomach tighten. Mercedes was orchestrating a campaign, gathering supporters before returning for a final battle. How many people did she manage to convince? "Enough to make trouble," admitted Don Esteban. "Mercedes may be cruel, but she understands people. She knows how to exploit their weaknesses and fears." "And Don Ignacio? Nervous as a cat during a storm. Since you showed him those letters, he has acted like a man expecting disaster at any moment." Doña Refugio sat up in bed, supported by pillows. "Don Esteban, did you know Isabel Villarreal when she lived here?" The old man's expression changed, becoming more thoughtful. "Yes, I knew her. Sweet girl, very different from her sister." "Why do you ask?" "Because we discovered some things about Isabel's death that could change everything." Don Esteban listened carefully as Doña Refugio explained what they had learned about Isabel's love for Santiago and Mercedes's manipulation. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes. "That explains a lot," he said finally. "Isabel used to come to my store sometimes, always asking about Santiago, when he would return from his travels, if he had mentioned her. I thought she was simply shy, but now you realize she was heartbroken," finished Melissa. "Yes, and Mercedes. Mercedes always seemed so protective of her, always saying Isabel was too delicate for the rough world. We all thought she was being a caring sister." "She was being a controlling sister," corrected Doña Refugio sharply, "using Isabel's gentleness against her." The sound of a horse galloping rapidly toward the house interrupted their conversation. Through the window they could see Santiago approaching, but something in his posture suggested urgency. He burst through the door, breathless and covered with dust. "We have a problem," he said without greeting. "Mercedes didn't go to Monterrey. She went to the capital." "Mexico City, why?" Santiago pulled a small leather journal from inside his shirt, Isabel's diary. "Because, according to this, Don Beltran wasn't just a corrupt local judge. He had connections with federal authorities, people who could make trouble for all of us if they decide to investigate." Melissa took the diary with trembling hands. The delicate handwriting covering the pages seemed to whisper Isabel's voice across the years. "What else does it say?" "Isabel documented everything. Mercedes's manipulation of her, the scheme to take our property, and—" Santiago hesitated. "And plans to stage my death to make it look like an accident." The room fell into shocked silence. "Your death?" Santiago's voice was barely a whisper. "Mercedes was planning to eliminate you if you became too difficult to control. Isabel overheard conversations between Mercedes and Don Beltran about hiring men from outside the region. Melissa felt cold spreading through her body. Mercedes wasn't just greedy and manipulative, she was willing to commit murder to achieve her goals. When was this planned? According to Isabel's last entries just before she died, which means Isabel's death wasn't just from heartbreak, concluded Doña Refugio grimly. She knew too much. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Isabel had died because she knew about Mercedes's murderous plans, then her death was essentially an assassination. Santiago began pacing, his hands clenched into fists. We have to expose this immediately, before Mercedes returns with whatever help she went to seek. How? Asked Melissa. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what proof do we have besides this diary? Actually, said Don Esteban quietly, there might be a way. All eyes turned to him. Tomorrow is the monthly town meeting. Everyone in the settlement attends to discuss community business. If we could present evidence publicly, Mercedes would have allies there, pointed out Santiago. Yes, but she would also have enemies. People who have suffered under Don Beltran's corruption. Families who have lost property through illegal seizures. Don Esteban stood, new energy flowing through him. Justice sometimes requires courage from an entire community, not just a few individuals. Melissa looked at the diary in her hands, then at Santiago, whose face showed a mixture of hope and determination. Then we'll do it, she said firmly. Tomorrow we tell everyone the truth about Mercedes Villarreal, Don Beltran and poor Isabel. And if Mercedes returns before then? Asked Doña Refugio. Santiago walked to the window, looking toward the mountains where clouds were gathering for another storm. Then we face her head-on. We have the truth on our side now. And sometimes truth is stronger than all the money and influence in the world. As he spoke those words, none of them noticed a figure watching from behind trees near the house, a local resident who had been paid well to report on their activities. By evening, a message would be speeding toward Mexico City, warning Mercedes that her secrets were about to be exposed. The battle for San Jacinto del Nogal was about to enter its final phase, and only one thing was certain. Not everyone would emerge unscathed. The municipal hall of San Jacinto del Nogal had never seen so many people gathered in a single occasion. Normally, the monthly meetings attracted only a dozen elderly citizens interested in discussing road repairs or water supply issues. That day, however, more than 50 people crowded into the modest space, creating an atmosphere of expectation that made the air seem denser. Melissa sat in the front row, between Santiago and Don Esteban, holding Isabel's diary against her chest like a protective shield. She had slept poorly, waking several times during the night with nightmares in which Mercedes returned accompanied by armed men to silence the truth forever. Don Ignacio presided over the meeting from a small table at the front of the hall, clearly nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he organized papers, and he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the audience. Beside him, a thin scribe took notes in hurried handwriting. "Order, order," said Don Ignacio, tapping a small wooden hammer on the table. "The monthly meeting of the San Jacinto del Nogal community is officially open." A murmur ran through the crowd when Santiago stood up. "Don Ignacio, I would like to make a presentation to the community about issues that affect all of us." The mayor hesitated, his small eyes searching for familiar faces in the audience, people he knew were loyal to him or who had received favors from Mercedes. "This isn't the time for personal matters, Santiago." "With all respect," said a voice from the back of the hall, "I believe everyone here would like to hear what Santiago Herrera has to say." It was Doña Carmen, an elderly woman whose property had been confiscated years before for questionable debts. Several other voices joined hers, creating a chorus of support that made Don Ignacio visibly retreat. "Very well," he said finally. "But let it be brief." Santiago walked to the front of the hall carrying a worn leather folder. When he turned to face the audience, Melissa saw in him a dignity and strength that contrasted with the haunted man who had returned just days before. "Citizens of San Jacinto del Nogal," he began, his voice carrying to all corners of the hall, "I came here today to speak about justice, about truths that have been buried and lies that have been planted in fertile soil." He opened the folder and took out several letters, the correspondence between Mercedes and Don Beltran they had found. For years, our community has been controlled by people who see you not as fellow citizens, but as resources to be exploited. People who charge illegal taxes, who manipulate elections, who decide who can prosper and who must suffer. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Don Ignacio shifted in his chair but didn't interrupt. These letters, continued Santiago, raising them so everyone could see, document a conspiracy between the late Don Beltran and Mercedes Villarreal to illegally appropriate properties, to deceive vulnerable women from other cities, and to remove anyone who opposed their plans. Those are just accusations, exploded Don Ignacio, jumping up abruptly. Where is the proof? Melissa then stood up, Isabel's diary in her hands. The proof is here, she said clearly. In the diary of Isabel Villarreal, Mercedes' sister, who documented not only the corruption she witnessed, but also plans to assassinate anyone who became an obstacle. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the small children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Isabel Villarreal has been dead for 5 years, said someone from the audience. Yes, replied Melissa. She died because she discovered her sister planned to assassinate Santiago Herrera when he refused to collaborate with her schemes. An explosion of voices filled the hall. People stood up, gestured, asked questions simultaneously. Don Ignacio banged the hammer repeatedly, trying to restore order. Order, order. These are very serious accusations that require immediate investigation, completed a new and authoritative voice from the hall's entrance. Everyone turned to see 3 men entering, 2 in military uniforms and a third in elegant civilian clothes. The civilian approached Don Ignacio's table with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I am Captain Rinaldo Mendoza from the federal garrison in Monterrey, said the uniformed man. We received reports of serious irregularities in this community and have come to investigate. Don Ignacio completely paled. We weren't notified of any federal investigation. Because it's a surprise investigation, replied the civilian. My name is Dr. Eduardo Salinas, attorney representing several people who have filed formal complaints against corrupt administrations in this region. Melissa felt her heart race. Where had these men come from? Who had called them? As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Salinas addressed her directly. Señorita Soledad, we received your letter 3 days ago, along with copies of documentary evidence, requesting our intervention in matters of municipal corruption and possible criminal conspiracy. Melissa looked at him with total confusion. My letter? I never wrote any letter to... I wrote it, said a familiar voice from the entrance. Everyone turned to see Mercedes Villarreal standing in the doorway, elegantly dressed as always, but with an expression Melissa had never seen before. A mixture of defiance and something that could have been relief. Mercedes, exclaimed Don Ignacio. What are you doing? Why did you bring federal authorities here? Mercedes walked slowly down the central aisle, her heels echoing in the absolute silence. When she reached the front of the hall, she turned to face the transfixed crowd. Because, she said clearly, it's time for the truth. Santiago looked at her with total distrust. What game is this, Mercedes? It's no game at all, she replied, her voice carrying a weariness Melissa had never heard before. It's confession. Dr. Salinas approached her. Señorita Villarreal, are you prepared to make your official statement? Mercedes nodded, then turned to the transfixed audience. Citizens of San Jacinto del Nogal, she began, I came here to admit my participation in crimes against this community, to ask forgiveness for damages I caused, and to ensure that the people really responsible for years of corruption are finally punished. Don Ignacio tried to stand up, but one of the soldiers gently forced him to remain seated. Mercedes, you don't know what you're doing, he said desperately. I know exactly what I'm doing, she replied. I'm choosing truth over self-preservation, something I should have done long ago. She turned to Santiago, and there was in her eyes a vulnerability Melissa had never seen. Santiago, you were right about me. I manipulated you, manipulated Isabel, and conspired against your family. But there are things you don't know, things that change everything. Like what? Like the fact that Don Beltran wasn't just my lover, said Mercedes, her voice breaking slightly. He was my father. And when I discovered he planned to eliminate me after getting your property, well, I realized I had become disposable, even to the man who raised me. The revelation caused another wave of shocked murmurs. Melissa felt as if the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. "That's why you denounced him to federal authorities," said Dr. Salinas. "Yes. And that's why I have complete evidence of all crimes committed here, not just by me but by Don Beltran, Don Ignacio and others." Mercedes opened an elegant handbag and removed a thick envelope. "Documents, correspondence, financial records. Everything you need to clean this community of corruption." Don Ignacio tried to stand again, this time with greater agitation. "You can't trust the word of a scorned woman. She's lying to get revenge." "Actually," said Dr. Salinas calmly, "we have already verified much of the information she provided. The evidence is quite convincing." He turned to address the entire assembly. "Citizens of San Jacinto del Nogal, based on the evidence presented and testimony received, we are placing Don Ignacio Vega under arrest for corruption, illegal seizure of property, and conspiracy. Additionally, we will be conducting a complete review of all administrative decisions made during his tenure." The hall exploded in celebration. People stood, applauded, some even cried with relief. Years of oppression and injustice were finally being addressed. But Melissa watched Mercedes with growing understanding. This wasn't simply a case of a woman scorned seeking revenge. It was something more complex, a daughter who had finally chosen justice over loyalty to a father who had ultimately betrayed her. "Mercedes," said Santiago quietly, approaching her as soldiers led Don Ignacio away, "why did you really do this?" Mercedes looked at him with eyes that held years of regret. "Because Isabel deserved justice, because you deserved to know the truth, and because—" She paused, looking around at the community she had helped oppress. "Because I wanted to feel human again." It was an admission that carried more weight than any legal document. And as Melissa watched Mercedes being led away by authorities, not as a prisoner, but as a protected witness, she understood that sometimes redemption comes through confession, and sometimes the greatest courage is found in finally telling the truth. The days following the municipal meeting passed like a whirlwind of official activity. Federal investigators established a temporary base in Don Ignacio's former office, and a constant procession of citizens arrived to give testimony about years of corruption and abuse of power. Melissa found herself in an unexpected position, being consulted as a key witness and, surprisingly, as someone whose insight into the situation was valued by the authorities. Her perspective as an outsider who had carefully documented events gave her unique credibility. "Señorita Soledad," said Dr. Salinas one sunny morning, finding her in the small garden she had begun to cultivate behind the house, "I would like to discuss Mercedes Villarreal's situation." Melissa stopped watering the tomato seedlings she had planted and turned to the lawyer. During the past week, she had developed respect for this man who treated even the most sordid cases with dignity and thoroughness. "For how can I help?" "Mercedes will be transferred to the capital to give complete testimony in related investigations. She probably won't return to San Jacinto del Nogal for a long time, if ever." Melissa nodded. She had expected this, but still felt conflicted about Mercedes. The revelation that she was Don Beltran's illegitimate daughter had complicated her feelings about the woman who had been simultaneously adversary and, in some ways, fellow victim. "Did she ask to speak with me before leaving?" "Yes, this afternoon, if you're willing." "I will be." Dr. Salinas hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "There's another matter. The property where you're living. All the legal trouble about ownership has been resolved. Santiago and Doña Refugio have clear title, and any documents suggesting otherwise have been deemed fraudulent. That's good news." "Yes, but it raises an important question." He looked directly into her eyes. "What are your plans, señorita? Do you intend to return to Puebla or establish a life here?" It was a question Melissa had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. Her original life in Puebla seemed distant now, like something that belonged to a different person. But committing to a new life in San Jacinto del Nogal meant confronting feelings and possibilities that still weren't clear to her. "I haven't decided yet," she said honestly. "Well, when you do decide, know that this community would benefit greatly from someone with your education and character. We'll be needing people to help rebuild institutions that were corrupted." After he left, Melissa returned to her gardening, but her mind was elsewhere. As afternoon approached, she felt increasingly nervous about meeting Mercedes. What could two women who had been adversaries possibly say to each other now that the truth was revealed? Santiago found her there as the sun was beginning to set, her hands still dirty from planting. "Dr. Salinas said you're meeting Mercedes today." "Yes. Are you bothered by that?" Santiago considered the question seriously before answering. "Not bothered. Curious, perhaps. And concerned about you." He sat on a small wooden crate that served as a makeshift bench. Mercedes is skilled at manipulation. Even when she's telling the truth, she knows how to use it to her advantage. "Do you think she has ulterior motives for wanting to speak with me?" "With Mercedes, there are always ulterior motives. The question is whether they align with something beneficial or harmful." Melissa wiped her hands on a cloth and sat beside him. During the past week, they had developed an easy companionship, working together to care for Doña Refugio and manage household affairs. But underlying the practical partnership was a tension neither had addressed directly. "Santiago," she said carefully, "when all this is settled, when the community has returned to normal, what happens to us?" The question hung in the air between them like a delicate thread. "I don't know," he admitted. "I came back here expecting to find only trouble and regret. Instead, I found possibilities I never imagined." "Like what?" "Like the chance to build something good from the ruins of something terrible, like discovering that my past doesn't have to define my future." He looked at her directly, "Like meeting a woman who made me remember that there is goodness in the world worth protecting." Melissa felt warmth spreading through her chest, but also apprehension. "These possibilities, they scare me," she admitted. "I came here believing in one story about my future, discovered it was fake, and now I'm not sure how to trust my own judgment about what's real." "Maybe," said Santiago gently, "real isn't something you trust. Maybe it's something you build day by day, choice by choice." Before Melissa could respond, a soldier approached, informing her that Mercedes was ready for their meeting. The encounter took place in the main room of the old municipal building, with two chairs placed facing each other and a guard discreetly positioned nearby. Mercedes looked different, still elegant, but tired in a way that expensive clothes couldn't disguise. "Melissa," said Mercedes when she entered, "thank you for coming." "Mercedes." Melissa sat, studying the woman who had been such a formidable opponent. "Dr. Salinas said you wanted to speak with me." "Yes, I owe you an apology and an explanation." "You don't owe me anything." "Actually, I do." Mercedes leaned forward, her green eyes intense but no longer calculating. "You see, when I first intercepted your letters to Santiago, my intention was simply to remove you as an inconvenience, another lonely woman who could be discarded." Melissa said nothing, letting Mercedes continue. "But after you arrived and I saw how you cared for Doña Refugio, how you refused to be intimidated or driven away, you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "Isabel." Mercedes's voice broke slightly. "You had her strength, her refusal to abandon people who needed help, and I realized I was trying to destroy in you the same qualities I had loved most in my sister." Melissa felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Mercedes, let me finish, please." Mercedes composed herself. "When I was young, before learning how cruel the world could be, I wanted to be like Isabel. Kind, giving, trusting. But life taught me that such qualities make you vulnerable, that people like our father use goodness against you. So you chose to become hard instead. I chose to become invulnerable. Or so I thought." Mercedes laughed bitterly. "But you showed me there's another choice, to be strong enough to be good despite the risks." Melissa studied Mercedes's face, seeing in it genuine remorse that seemed to go beyond simple regret about being caught. "What will happen to you now?" "I'll testify against everyone involved in the corruption here, then exile probably. I have some money saved, enough to start over somewhere where no one knows my history." "And that's what you want?" "To start over." Mercedes was quiet for a long moment. "What I want is impossible, to undo years of harm, to bring Isabel back, to be a person worthy of redemption." She looked directly at Melissa. "But maybe starting over is the next best thing." "Mercedes," said Melissa carefully, "if you truly want redemption, perhaps exile isn't the answer. Perhaps staying and helping to repair the damage you helped create." "No, Mercedes cut her off gently but firmly. This community deserves to heal without a constant reminder of what I represent. And I need to find out who I am when I'm not fighting to survive or scheming to advance. Melissa understood. Sometimes healing required distance, time, and a chance to discover aspects of yourself that had been buried under years of defensiveness. I hope you find peace, she said sincerely. And I hope, replied Mercedes, standing to leave, that you find the courage to trust happiness when it offers itself to you. As Mercedes was led away, Melissa remained seated, processing their conversation. A woman who had been her enemy had become, unexpectedly, a source of wisdom about embracing possibilities despite fear. When she finally returned home, she found Santiago sitting with Doña Refugio on a small porch they had built together during the week. The old woman looked stronger than Melissa had ever seen her, and Santiago looked settled in a way that suggested peace with his own past. "How was it?" asked Doña Refugio. "Unexpected," replied Melissa. "But good, I think." "And now?" asked Santiago. Melissa looked at these two people who had become so important to her, at the small house that felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived, at a community that was slowly healing from years of oppression. "Now," she said, sitting beside them as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, "I think it's time for me to stop running from possibilities and start building something real." Santiago reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed, and for the first time since arriving in San Jacinto del Nogal, Melissa felt completely certain about a choice she was making. 3 weeks had passed since Mercedes left San Jacinto del Nogal, leaving behind a settlement that slowly began to find its own rhythm, free from the manipulations that had shaped its life for so long. The federal investigation had concluded its main activities, ensuring that illegally confiscated properties were returned to their rightful owners and that a new administrative system was established. Melissa had found a routine that brought her unexpected satisfaction. Her mornings were dedicated to caring for Doña Refugio, who continued to recover steadily, and to household tasks she discovered were more fulfilling than any work she had done in Puebla. Her afternoons she spent helping other families who were struggling to rebuild after years of oppression, using her education to help with paperwork, correspondence, and planning. But it was in the evenings that she felt most conflicted. Santiago had returned to his old routine of caring for the small plot of land behind the house, and together they had established a comfortable domesticity that felt natural and right. Yet, underneath the easy companionship, tension was building toward a conversation both knew was inevitable. The moment came one evening when Doña Refugio had retired early, leaving Melissa and Santiago alone by a small fire they had built outside to ward off the chill that autumn was bringing to the mountains. "Melissa," said Santiago, watching flames dance in the darkness, "we need to talk about the future." She had been expecting this, but still felt her heart rate increase. "What about it? About what you want? About whether this—" He gestured toward the house, the land, himself. "Whether this is really what you choose, or if it's just what happened to you." Melissa considered his words carefully. It was a fair question, one she had been asking herself repeatedly. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "When I first came here, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. A husband, a stable home, security in exchange for companionship and domestic capability. And now I realize those weren't really desires. They were resignation. I was accepting a limited version of life because I thought it was all that was available to me." Santiago poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "And what do you want now?" Melissa stood and walked to the edge of their small yard, where she could see lights flickering in windows throughout the village. Each light represented a family, a story, possibilities for connection and community she had never experienced in Puebla. "I want to matter," she said finally. "I want to wake up each morning knowing that my presence in this world makes a difference to someone." "And you feel that here?" "Yes, but—" She turned to face him. "I want it to be my choice, not something that happened to me by accident or desperation." Santiago joined her at the edge of the yard. "What would make it your choice?" It was a question that got to the heart of what was troubling her. During her weeks in San Jacinto del Nogal, she had found purpose and satisfaction, but had also developed feelings for Santiago That complicated everything. How could she trust her judgment about staying when her emotions were involved? I need to know I'm choosing this life for its own merits, not because I'm attached to you, she said honestly. Santiago was quiet for a long moment. And how would you know that? I think, said Melissa slowly, I need to experience making this choice without emotional pressure. I need to know I can be independent here before deciding whether I want to be interdependent. You want me to leave? No. The response came more quickly than she expected. No, This is your home. I'm the one who needs to clarify her own mind. Santiago studied her face in the firelight. What are you suggesting? Melissa took a deep breath, formulating a plan that had been forming subconsciously for days. I want to establish my own place here, find a way to support myself, to contribute to the community independently, to prove to myself that I'm choosing this life from strength, not from desperation or dependence. And then, if I still choose to be here, if we still feel what we feel for each other, we can explore that from a position of equality and choice. Santiago considered this for several minutes, looking out over the village that was slowly recovering its own identity. It's a good plan, he said finally. Scary, but good. You think so? I think you're wise to want to choose from strength, and I think that, I think any future we might have together would be better if both of us are whole people choosing each other, not two half people trying to complete themselves through a relationship. His understanding and support made Melissa feel both relieved and slightly disappointed. Part of her had hoped he would protest, would declare he couldn't live without her. But his willingness to respect her need for independence was, she realized, more meaningful than passionate declarations would have been. So what's your plan? He asked. Well, Dr. Salinas mentioned that the community needs someone to help coordinate rebuilding efforts, someone qualified to handle correspondence and documentation, and several families have asked me to teach their children to read and write. You could establish a school. Exactly. A small school initially, but something that could grow, something that would give me purpose and independence. Santiago smiled, and there was pride in his expression that made Melissa's heart flutter. Teacher Soledad, he said. It suits you. And you? What are your plans? I'm thinking about expanding beyond just farming. There's demand for skilled metalwork, tools, hardware, decorative pieces. I could establish a small smithy, maybe take on an apprentice. So we would both be establishing ourselves independently. Yes, and if, in 6 months or a year, we still feel— He paused, looking directly at her. If we still want to explore possibilities between us, then we'll do so as two people who chose each other after knowing themselves. Melissa felt a mixture of relief, anticipation, and yes, disappointment. This plan made perfect sense, was mature and thoughtful and wise. So why did part of her want to throw caution aside and simply choose passion over prudence? Santiago, she said impulsively, before we commit to this path, could I ask something of you? Anything. Could you kiss me? Just once so we know what we're choosing to postpone. Santiago looked surprised, then amused, then serious. Are you certain that's wise? Probably not. But I want to know. He stepped closer, hesitating just briefly before cupping her face gently in his hands. When he kissed her, it was gentle but not tentative. A kiss that spoke of attraction acknowledged but not pursued, of possibilities reserved for proper timing. When they separated, Melissa felt her resolve both strengthened and weakened. The kiss confirmed that their attraction was real and significant, but also proved she was right to want to approach their potential relationship from a position of strength rather than need. 6 months, she said softly. 6 months, he agreed. And as they returned to the house together, both knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new phase of their relationship, a phase defined by conscious choice rather than circumstance, Melissa felt a deep sense of rightness about the direction they were choosing. Sometimes, she reflected, real courage meant slowing down rather than rushing forward, meant choosing uncertainty over immediate gratification. And sometimes the strongest foundation for love was built not on passion, but on respect for each other's autonomy and growth. A year had passed since Melissa made the decision to establish her independence in San Jacinto del Nogal. Autumn painted the mountains with golden and red tones, and the small school she had founded in an adobe house loaned by the community now buzzed with the energy of 15 children between 5 and 12 years old. "Maestra Melissa," called young Carmen, an 8-year-old girl with braids that danced when she moved. "Could you help me with these letters?" Melissa smiled, walking over to where Carmen struggled with a composition about her family. The children had started calling her Maestra naturally, and the title filled her with a warmth she had never experienced in her previous work. "Let's see," said Melissa, sitting beside Carmen. "You want to write about your grandmother's garden, correct?" "Sí, pero no sé cómo escribir caléndulas en español." "Caléndulas," said Melissa, writing the word carefully so Carmen could copy it. "And remember, when you're describing something beautiful, think about not just how it looks but how it smells, how it feels." As Carmen returned to her work, Melissa looked around her small classroom. The walls were decorated with children's drawings and writings, maps they had created together of their region, and a large chart showing their progress in reading levels. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with purpose and growth. "Maestra," said Diego, a serious 10-year-old boy who had become her most advanced student, "my mother wants to know if you could teach her to read too." "Of course," replied Melissa. "Tell her to come Thursday afternoon. We're starting a class for adults who want to learn." This had become a pattern. As children learned, their parents became interested. Several mothers now attended evening classes, and 2 fathers had asked her to help them with basic math for their businesses. Melissa had discovered that teaching gave her a satisfaction that ran deeper than any work she had ever done. As afternoon wound down and children gathered their slates and books to leave, Melissa heard familiar footsteps outside. Through the window she could see Santiago approaching, carrying a carefully wrapped package. Their interactions over the past year had been cordial, warm but carefully bounded. They saw each other regularly. San Jacinto was too small to avoid interaction, but both had respected the space they had created for independent growth. Melissa had been proud of how well he had established his smithy, and he had expressed genuine admiration for the success of her school. "Buenas tardes, maestra," said Santiago formally when he entered, though his eyes held warmth that was anything but formal. "Buenas tardes, Señor Herrera," she replied, playing along with their public propriety while suppressing a smile. "I brought something for the school," he said, setting down his package carefully. Melissa opened it to reveal a beautiful wooden placard, expertly carved, that read, "Escuela de San Jacinto del Nogal, Maestra Melissa Soledad." "Santiago," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood and precise lettering. "This is beautiful. You've earned it. The children, the parents, everyone talks about how much difference you've made. It feels good to matter," she admitted. "To know that my work has impact." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, admiring the sign that represented so much more than a simple school. "Melissa," said Santiago quietly, "it's been almost exactly a year since we made our agreement." Her heart rate increased. She had been thinking about this constantly for weeks, but hearing him acknowledge it made everything suddenly more real. "Yes, it has been. Have you come to any conclusions about what you want?" Melissa walked to the window, looking out at the village that had become genuinely home to her. In the distance, she could see the small house where Doña Refugio now lived comfortably, cared for by a rotation of women from the community. The old woman had recovered more fully than anyone expected, and now spent her days weaving and telling stories to the children. "I've learned that I can be happy here," she said finally. "Independent, useful, content. I've built a life that has meaning for me. And I've also learned that independence doesn't require isolation, that building something with someone else doesn't necessarily mean losing yourself." Santiago stepped closer, though still maintaining proper distance. "What does that mean for us?" Melissa turned to face him directly. "It means that if you're still interested in exploring possibilities between us, I'm ready to do so as a woman who knows her own worth and has chosen her own path. And if I told you, I've never stopped being interested, that watching you build this life, seeing you thrive and grow, has only made me more certain that you're exceptional." Melissa felt warmth spread through her entire body. "I would say that sounds like a good foundation for beginning something new." "Beginning slowly," Santiago added, "carefully, as two people who want to build something together without losing what they've discovered about themselves." "Exactly." Santiago reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "I made something else." he said hesitantly. If you're interested. Melissa unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple ring, not gold or silver, but beautiful steel worked in an intricate pattern that caught the light. It's not traditional, Santiago said quickly. I know a ring should be gold, but I wanted to make something with my own hands, something that represented who we are rather than what society expects. Santiago, interrupted Melissa softly. It's perfect. You understand what I'm asking. You're asking if I want to explore a future together. If I want to see where this path leads, when walked by two people who are choosing each other freely. Exactly. Melissa looked at the ring, at Santiago's hopeful but patient expression, at the school around them that represented her own achievement and independence. For the first time in her life, she was being offered love from a position of strength rather than desperation. Yes, she said simply. I would like that very much. When Santiago slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like more than an engagement. It felt like a celebration of two people who had found not just love, but wisdom about how to love well. So, said Santiago, smiling broadly, what happens now? Now, replied Melissa, admiring how the ring looked on her hand, we take our time. We plan thoughtfully. We build something beautiful together, while maintaining the beautiful things we've built separately. And then, we see where life takes two people who chose each other because they wanted to, not because they needed to. As they walked home together through the village streets, Melissa marveled at how different this felt from her original journey to San Jacinto del Nogal. Then, she had been seeking rescue from loneliness. Now, she was choosing partnership from fulfillment. It was, she reflected, a much better foundation for a shared life. The wedding of Melissa and Santiago was celebrated on a golden spring morning, 2 years after her arrival in San Jacinto del Nogal. It wasn't a grand ceremony. It took place in the yard of the house they now shared, decorated with wildflowers the school children had gathered in the mountains. Doña Refugio, now 82 but still lucid and determined, officiated the ceremony using a traditional authority the community recognized. Melissa Soledad and Santiago Herrera, said the elderly woman with a clear voice that carried to all present, you have come to each other through tortuous paths, but you have arrived as complete people, choosing to share a life that each has built with their own hands. Melissa looked at Santiago, dressed in a simple white shirt he had washed and ironed himself, and felt deep gratitude that they had waited. The man standing before her was different from the one who had returned 3 years before. He had found peace with himself, had built a reputation as a skilled craftsman, and had learned to carry his past without being defined by it. Santiago, continued Doña Refugio, do you promise to love this woman not to complete yourself, but to share the fullness you have found in yourself? I promise, he replied, his voice firm but emotional. Melissa, do you promise to love this man, not because you need him, but because you choose to walk beside him toward a future you will build together? I promise, said Melissa, surprising herself with how much certainty was in her voice. When they exchanged rings, both made by Santiago in his workshop, engraved with patterns representing their intertwined but distinct stories, Melissa felt she was participating in something fundamentally different from any wedding she had imagined in her youth. This wasn't about mutual salvation or social convenience. It was about two people who had found their own strengths, deciding to multiply them through partnership. The celebration that followed was modest, but joyful. The community had contributed food, music, and stories. Melissa observed the children from her school playing among the improvised tables, the parents who now knew how to read and write thanks to her evening classes, the women who had become her friends and confidants. Maestra, said Carmen, now 10 and one of the most advanced students, will you continue being our teacher after you're married? Of course, replied Melissa, kneeling to be at the girl's height. Why wouldn't I continue? My aunt said married women don't work. Some women choose not to work outside the home after marriage, and that's fine. Others choose to continue with their professions. The important thing is being able to choose. Santiago approached, having overheard the conversation. Carmen, he said gently, Maestra Melissa will continue teaching because that's what she loves to do, and because it's important for our community. My job is to support her in that, not prevent her. The simplicity and naturalness of his declaration made Melissa fall in love with him again. In an era when many men expected their wives to abandon any independent identity, Santiago had understood that his love for her included love for what she had become. Later, when the guests had left and they were alone in their house, now expanded with 2 additional rooms Santiago had built, Melissa sat on the porch that overlooked the settlement. "What are you thinking about?" asked Santiago, joining her with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "I'm thinking about how different I am from the woman who arrived here 3 years ago." "How so?" "That woman was fleeing loneliness, accepting any chance not to be alone. This woman—" She gestured toward the school she could see in the distance, the houses where her friends lived, the workshop where Santiago created works of art in metal. "This woman has a life she chose consciously. And do you regret anything?" Melissa considered the question seriously. "I don't regret coming, even knowing it was based on a lie. I don't regret staying when I discovered the truth. And I definitely don't regret choosing you after learning to choose myself first." "Do you know what impresses me most about our story?" said Santiago. "What?" "It proves that sometimes what seems like a terrible mistake can be the first step towards something true." Melissa nodded, thinking of Mercedes, who had found her own form of redemption working with orphans in the capital, and of Don Ignacio, who had served his sentence and now lived quietly in a distant city. Even the most painful parts of her journey had contributed to bringing her to this moment. "Santiago," she said, turning to look at him directly, "what do you hope for from our life together?" "I hope for honest work, mature love, and perhaps—" He hesitated with a shy smile. "Perhaps a small family, if that's what we want." "A family?" "Not necessarily our own children, though that would be wonderful if it happened. But family in the broader sense. People we care for, who care for us, a home where there's always room for one more place at the table." Melissa felt unexpected tears stinging her eyes. It was exactly the kind of life she had learned to value. Not grandiose or dramatic, but deep and meaningful. "I want that too," she said. They remained sitting in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the clear mountain sky. Somewhere in the distance, one of the neighbors' dogs barked softly, and the sound of low voices drifted from other houses where families were preparing for the night. "Melissa," said Santiago eventually, "there's something I want to tell you." "What is it?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing something worthy in me when I couldn't see it myself. For staying when it would have been easier to leave. For teaching me it's possible to choose love from strength instead of desperation." Melissa took his hand, feeling the ring he had made for her and that now symbolized much more than a simple commitment. "Santiago, you gave me something even more precious." "What was that?" "You showed me I was capable of building a life worth living. That I could be useful, loved, and independent at the same time." When they finally got up to go inside the house, Melissa took one last look at the settlement that had become her home. San Jacinto del Nogal was still a small and sometimes difficult place, but it was a place where she mattered, where her presence made a difference, where she had found not just love, but purpose. And that, she reflected as Santiago blew out the candles, and they prepared for their first night as husband and wife, was infinitely more valuable than any romantic fantasy she had nurtured in her youth. Real love, she had discovered, wasn't about being rescued or completing someone else. It was about 2 people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep satisfaction that comes from creating meaning together. It was, without doubt, worth every moment of uncertainty, every tear shed, every moment of doubt she had experienced on her journey to this place and this moment. As she fell asleep in Santiago's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and feeling completely at peace for the first time in her life, Melissa knew that some stories have endings that are actually beginnings, and this was one of them.